Teaching While Queer is a podcast for LGBTQIA plus teachers, administrators, and well, anyone who works in academia to share their stories. Hi, my name is Bryan Stanton, a queer theater educator in San Antonio, Texas. Each week, I bring you stories from around the world centered on the experiences of LGBTQIA folks in academia. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and enjoy Teaching While Queer. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Teaching While Queer. I am so excited to have with me today Katelyn Hartman-Geier, who is joining me from St. Louis, Missouri. Hi, Katelyn.
Hey there, Bryan. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, too. Hey, tell me a little bit about yourself. What do you teach? How do you identify with the community?
So I teach elementary health and PE. So I had the little biddies, grades kindergarten through fifth grade. I am a cisgender lesbian. And I'm just outside of St. Louis. I teach in a suburb, but I live more in the rural side, the outskirts of St. Louis.
Awesome. You are my second teacher from St. Louis. I have a friend of mine who I know from grad school who teaches theater in St. Louis. So it's super fun to get your perspective because mine is from Texas. So I love hearing from people all over the place. To get started, can we take a little time trip? Can you tell me a little bit about your experience growing up as a queer student?
Oh, man. Okay. So I wasn't really aware of like anything queer whatsoever growing up. Okay. So I'm going to date myself a little bit. I was in elementary school in like the 90s. My family's super Catholic, love them to death, but very religious. And we just didn't have those conversations. I didn't really see myself in anything, but also I didn't even know what queer was. I knew like gay people were like bad and, we go to hell or whatever. So, okay, I have a flashbulb memory and this is like when I knew, I was in second grade and we had this assembly and the high school dancers came over, like the theater kids. They put on a production. It was really cool. And at the end of it, my best friend's like, wow, the boys are really cute. And I'm like, the boys? Oh. I'm like, oh, well, yeah, I guess they're great too. I was looking at the blonde lady right there. And they're like, what do you mean? So at that point, I'm like, oh, I wasn't supposed to respond like that. That's different. So, and just like throughout like my glow up from elementary to high school, I had like these little moments where it was like, kind of makes you think, but I just didn't acknowledge that because it wasn't something that I just wasn't aware of it. It was still very taboo. It wasn't talked about. And because it wasn't talked about, I didn't have the language to describe, my experiences or how I felt.
100%. I have that similar experience because I also grew up in the 90s. And so it was a wild time for me because we literally just didn't have the language because it was something that was so taboo. We just never talked about it. Yes. And so like, I think I was called words before I even knew what those words meant.
Yes.
And so it was just such an interesting time. And like, more words are even being developed as an adult. I'm seeing new words that are coming out to help us with the community and kind of self-identification. And I just think it's so interesting that like the words came after the realizations. Like I'm different.
Yes. Well, even now, like you said, like, we're more aware of different diversities of identities and everything else. We're creating more language to better describe what people feel and how they are and who they are. It's evolution.
Yep. I just finished watching the new League of Their Own series, and have you seen it?
Yes.
And so I didn't know, like, and I've studied a lot of LGBTQ history. I have a minor in it from grad school or undergrad. And I've studied a lot of LGBTQ history, and I'd never heard the term invert. And I was like, that's such an interesting word, because I always knew that the the vocabulary of like queers and queer, and that word popped up a lot in the series, but the word invert was new for me, and I was like, see, look, every day you're learning something new that's used as an identifier. Granted,
Well, even
with not a good identifier, but
yes. Even my kids at school, elementary kids, teach me new words every day. Like, a sapiosexual. What? I need a little education on that.
And
it's you're attracted to someone's, is it a mental connection?
I think it's intellect.
Intellectual, yes.
Yeah. I have friends who are like, I'm totally a sapiosexual, and I'm like, cool, love it. There's another one, I can't remember the terminology for it, but it's being attracted to talent, and I was like, huh.
I get that.
Yeah, I could see that.
Mm-hmm.
So, given that kind of realization and not knowing the language, what was it like to then kind of develop your own language and identity for yourself as you grew older?
I would self-describe myself as a tomboy, but like instead of lesbian, I'm just a tomboy. And the time I was dating, I was in high school, so I was dating boys. And when I was in college, I'm just an athlete, so that's why I dress a certain way. And then like when I really did some deep digging into myself and some reflection of myself, it's, really, I was just using that as a shield for my real identity as a lesbian. I clung to something that the straight community accepted as okay. And then once I finally had that bomb drop, I realized I was a lesbian. That's when I shifted that tomboy identity to that lesbian identity.
I think it's so funny because I was just used to joke about the fact that like, I think in the 90s, as a teenager, it was like, oh, I'm straight. Oh, I'm bisexual. Hey, I'm gay. Congratulations. Like you get that middle ground. And so I think so many of us, especially because the language hadn't developed really at the time, identified in all these different categories and just kind of didn't talk about the other part of it.
Yes.
So I feel that like as I'm an artist. I was a band kid, a choir kid, and a theater kid. And so I was just an artist. And so even though I'm not innately effeminate, I have more eccentricities than most people. And so I just attributed it for a while to being artistic, and it's that trope, that stereotypical trope of what is a theater kid is that weird kid, and the band kid is over sexualized, like all these things that we've seen play out in movies over the years. And so we kind of like, I'll just put myself in this box until I understand what box I'm actually in.
Yes. For the longest time, I put myself in a softball box. It's like, ooh, that tracks really well. Here I am teaching PE. Just check off another stereotype, But no, I do feel like we cling to social norms as kind of like a gateway into allowing ourselves to like accept who we are.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do you think your experience has informed you as a queer educator?
For me, so when I was growing up and having these self-doubts, I wanted validation somewhere for how I was feeling. I didn't see a whole lot of successful queer adults. They were demonized. They were, that people would call them the F word. They would use these slurs against them. They were seen as like othered or gross. So like, for me as an educator, I find myself in a position where I can exemplify or be a role model for a successful queer adult. This is an audio medium, but for me, I present as more androgynous. I have short hair. My clothes would be more stereotyped as masculine. I present more masculine. But for me, I can also show my students that to be a female, to be a woman, it's not just skirts and heels and long hair and makeup. There is a spectrum of what a woman is.
Absolutely.
what you look like doesn't identify who you are. It's who you are on the inside is who you are. So I strive to be a role model for my students that might be questioning themselves or might be othered, that they can see themselves reflected back.
And what has your experience been like as a queer educator, either with your staff or administration? Has it been pretty positive?
Honestly, so I'm in Missouri and we're a hot mess, not gonna lie. But I really consider myself extremely fortunate. So with my district, I personally haven't felt any negativity about how I present myself or my sexual orientation. My staff has been phenomenal since I got hired on. I've had a couple hiccups with, every once in a while, but in general, it's been amazing. I have a lot of allies in the building. I have a lot of advocates who, maybe a student says something that they don't mean, but, maybe they heard it at home. And I'll ask, a colleague, hey, what do you think? And I feel like I can be open with those conversations with my colleagues. No parents have approached me with any issues. If they have them, that's their problem, but they haven't approached me with any issues. My students, when they hear that I'm married to another woman, they're curious. When I got engaged, I remember I had this conversation with my assistant principal. I said, hey, what do I respond? How do I respond to the kids when they ask why I'm wearing a ring? Like, what's the policy? Am I allowed to say my fiance, and if they ask who it is, to say they're a woman? Like, is that okay? Will I get in trouble? My wife's name is gender neutral. So I could get away with saying, oh, my fiance's name is Sam. I could slide by with that. And my assistant principal said, no, you do whatever you feel is best. And she said, you don't have to hide who you are. We'll support you no matter what. But that's been my experience. And I am very fortunate, especially considering the area of St. Louis I'm in. Like I said, I've been very, very, very fortunate. I'm a little spoiled here.
That's wonderful. I think it's fantastic. But also at the same time, one other thing that I personally struggle with is the fact that we have to ask those questions.
Yes.
When I started at my current campus, this is the second school I've ever taught at. I didn't have great experiences at my first school when it came to support from the administration on certain things. And so when I came into my new job, I was like, okay, looking around, people are setting up their classrooms. I'm with my teaching partner, and I turned to her and I was like, you see that on the wall? Like how she has her whole family up there and pictures of her with her husband, at their wedding. Like I could never do that. And then she forced me to put them up in my room. She was like, you absolutely need to do that. You cannot.
Oh, she's a keeper.
Yeah, I was like, I won the lottery of teaching partners.
Yes.
Because I was so self-conscious. Even I had an experience at my previous school where my first principal was like, maybe you shouldn't come out so quickly. And so then I realized maybe 2 years later that I stopped putting my family in my about me introduction thing. And I think it was subconscious because I was rushing to do it.
Yeah.
Because they don't give enough prep time for things at the start of a school year. But I went and looked back at them over the years and was like, wow, I completely started omitting my family, and then I put them back in because subconsciously I had taken what he had said to heart, and I was also rushing. So it's interesting, the fact that we live in this kind of world where there are a different set of rules and we have to ask if it's okay.
Yeah. Or even subconsciously. I had the same conundrum with pictures of my family. My co-teacher, her and I have a great relationship. At the beginning of the year, she does a little about me slide. We project it in the gym. And she has a picture of her and her boys and her dog and a little about me. And I always hesitate, even though I know that my administration has my back. I always hesitate, ooh, do I want to put our picture up there with our cats? But yeah, even that just some subconscious stuff, working through that. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I know you teach younger kids, but have you had the experience of working with any queer students?
Yes. This year, 2 kids came out to me as queer. One identifies as trans. The other one identifies as non-binary. It's been, I'm not gonna lie, I've made a lot of mistakes on the path because I have known those kids for a while, and I've associated one kid with being female for 5 years. So I've definitely had to do some deep dives into how I interact with a student. Am I honoring their identity? Am I supporting them in class? Um, there have been some tricky spots with some other kids misgendering them, but also that student not really being completely out to their peers, and just it's been a tricky year, but also a learning year for me on how I can better be there for my kids and help them feel seen and validated in my space.
Absolutely. I think it's so interesting for those of us who teach more of the elective classes because we do have this multi-year experience with our students, whereas in an elementary setting, you're going to have the student maybe 1 year, maybe 2. And when you get to secondary, it's usually going to be a 1-year process unless you teach one of those electives. And so we do get to know this person and kind of have to go through the similar processes, not the same, but similar processes as parents because we've known these kids for a long time. What do you do when you find yourself having misgendered a child?
The students, bless their hearts, they absolutely call me out, as they should. Like, Mrs. HG, that's not who I am. It's like, oh, you're right. I'm so sorry. Thank you for correcting me. But I make sure that if I misgender them or misidentify them in front of their peers, that I correct myself in front of their peers also. Because I also need to demonstrate what it's like when one of their peers misgenders them, how they should interact. But no, they are very, very open with me when I slip up, and I apologize immediately. And it's, like I said, it's something I need to work on. It's not a them, it's a me issue. Not so much issue, really, more of just a learning curve for me.
Yeah, that's a memory thing. I had an instance happening earlier this year where I like literally only known this child as the name they asked me to call them. But attendance records, right, for schools use birth names. And so we're stuck looking at a list of students and constantly seeing this name, even if we never call it to them. And like after months, we'll have used the wrong name. And I'm like, I am so sorry. I don't even know why that's in my head. I've never called you that before. And I mean, the great thing is that the students are understanding, but I also make a big deal, like you said, of correcting myself in front of people and making sure that like that's the culture we have is apologize and change. Not just brush it off.
Yes.
Yeah.
Reflection and growth. Absolutely.
Reflection and growth, indeed. So, have you had any experiences where you've had students who maybe don't support the LGBTQ community? You mentioned something earlier about students maybe having learned something at home.
Yeah. I've had kids like blurt out, "That's so gay," stuff like that, on the playground, maybe in my space when we're playing a game. And I try to call that to attention. I'll bring the kid over, say like, "Why did you say that's so gay?" "Well, he did this." "Well, but why did you say that's so gay when he did this?" So like, I'll try to investigate why a child is associating something negative with gay. And it's usually they hear it online, they hear it on TikTok, they hear it maybe at home. And we try to investigate why, and okay, let's find a different word. I've heard kids just not understand what gay meant. They think gay is weird. Well, then we have a different type of discussion. I haven't really had a child use gay knowingly and as an insult, like as a direct, "Oh, you like the same gender," kind of insult or a slur like that. It's more of saying someone is less than, which we can unpack also.
Sure.
And we do unpack. Or I've heard someone say, "Oh, look, we're lesbians. We like girls." Like, well, that's not how that works. Let's have a conversation. You're a boy. Like, no, you're just saying that to be silly.
Yeah.
We're going to use different words.
I'm glad you know what the word means, but let's use it in the right context.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. I think it's interesting at that time because I have an 8-year-old and I'm kind of watching just how social things get, and I'm assuming that you deal with this a lot, but I've never taught elementary, so I don't really know. The genderification of activities and things like, oh, you
Yes.
can't do that because you're a boy, and you can't do that because you're a girl. Um, have you experienced stuff like that in your educational background?
Yes. So I play women's professional tackle football.
Oh wow,
And oh, I love it.
that's awesome.
It's like free therapy. It
I love
really
how you
is.
just like casually drop that in.
No big deal. Fancy. Um, but we've had discussions like, yes, girls can play football. Yes, girls can play sports. Um, yes, girls can also kick butt. No, the WNBA isn't a joke. They're just underfunded. Like we tried to get rid of the gender in sports and just focus on sport is sport. Sport is there for enjoyment. It's there for competitions, for personal growth. There should not be a gender associated with sports because anyone could do any sport.
I agree with that entirely. And it's so interesting to listen to my daughter say like, "Oh yeah, we played football today and it would have been not a thing, when I was younger."
Yes. Yeah, we have great discussions. And, one of the kids bring up, oh, did you see, this game the other night? Well, said, well, did you see this game also? I'll try to bring up, I said, oh, well, this person, the best athlete ever. Well, I don't know, Serena Williams, she's pretty phenomenal too. So we'll try to like find equal discussions with men and women in sport.
That's awesome. That got me thinking about something, but it has just slipped my mind. Sports. All right, it's gone. We're gonna move on.
So we do sometimes bring up, well, we've had discussions on trans athletes.
Oh wow.
And that's always been a tricky discussion. We usually fifth graders bring it up. Something will hit the news. And we'll do warm-ups and they'll just come up to me and ask, hey, what do you think about this example? And we try to bring it back to what the situations they're bringing up are about kids in sport. And I don't know about Texas where you're at, but in Missouri, they're working on some legal, like making somewhat like banning trans men or trans women in women's sports. So we'll talk about it being kids playing sports.
Yeah.
This person's a child, let them play.
Well, I mean, if sports is for any gender, if we can, I've literally seen young women on the football teams here in Texas, which is huge because Texas is huge about football.
Yes,
and
culture.
It is a big part of the culture. And so to have young women playing on these teams, if young women can play on these teams, what does it matter?
Yes, exactly. I mean, when I play football, we play against trans women also. And we'll destroy them just as we destroy the person next to them. It doesn't matter who's lined up against us. You're still our competition.
100%. I find it so interesting because here in Texas, there are still some things that are like gendered when it comes to sports, which is really weird for me. One is volleyball, like women play volleyball, but we have men and women doing wrestling teams.
Yeah.
And I was just like, men can't play volleyball? Like, what's up?
Oh, that drives me nuts. Yeah, I've been to some amazing men's volleyball games, and they are just as enjoyable. Men can do them. They're just as capable.
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing to be so specific about.
Yes.
So let's talk a little bit about why you chose to get into education, because it is definitely a labor of love.
It is. I had some phenomenal teachers growing up. Teachers that believed in me. Okay, I was a really shy, quiet, like sat in the back of the room, never raised my hand, never spoke out kind of kid. I was very anxious. I didn't have a whole lot of friends, but like my teachers tried so hard to make me feel loved and included. And I wanted to be that person for someone else. So I used to actually hate PE class. Um, I had some real jerks for PE teachers when I was itty bitty. And I remember loving the class itself. I loved playing games. I loved competition. I loved sport. I loved being active. But because I wasn't a top athlete in my class, I felt like I don't know, I felt a certain kind of way about my teachers. It wasn't until I was in high school where I had a weightlifting coach. I took weightlifting because I didn't want to take PE because I hated PE. That's how you get around that. But I had this weightlifting coach, and he inspired me. Like, he was just so kind to me. I was one of only 2 girls in the class, and he would cheer me on. He'd say, thanks for coming today. I'm glad you're here. Let's go see what you can do today. But it's just like, I just felt so encouraged and so loved. And I remember like how that made me feel about a subject that I hated. All of a sudden I loved, and I wanted to be that person for a kid who might have a similar experience as me. I wanted to be that positive person and create that positive PE experience.
That's awesome. I think that is so interesting as well, because teachers can be so impactful with your interest in a subject as a student. Like, I remember that having a really phenomenal 8th grade history teacher, and then just loving history after that. And if it wasn't for her, I don't even know that I'd be where I am, because I initially thought I was going to be a social studies teacher when I decided to go into teaching. So here we are. But I think it's so interesting how, in your experience, the teachers made you feel, like you didn't like the environment, you just loved the content.
Yes.
And so I think it's so cool that later on you were able to connect with just loving that so much that you wanted to bring that environment and tie it in with the content for students in the future. So that's pretty phenomenal, because sometimes those bad teachers can be debilitating. They really can.
Absolutely. I'm also a former band nerd, such as yourself. Yeah. We're a type, that's for sure. But like, for me, marching band was also one of the best experiences I've ever had in my life. I still have my French horn. I still have those memories. I still if I hear marching band practice, my heart still skips a beat. I still have that energy. And honestly, it's because of the teachers I had. It's wild how great teachers can give us these lasting memories and these lasting identifiers we have in ourselves.
Absolutely. So we're getting towards the end of our interview. I have 2 questions for you to kind of wrap things up. The first one is, what advice would you give to a new teacher who may not know whether they should be their authentic self in their classroom?
To me, it's find your people. Every building is going to have someone who is going to be an ally, or at least has an open heart and is willing to listen. For me, once you have your people, once you have your allies and you can identify, that's your support. Maybe you have, an ignorant parent or an ignorant situation or just an uncomfortable situation. You want to just talk or scheme or something. Finding your people in your building who are going to have your back, who are sounding boards, who you can vent or cry or whatever to. Finding your people, honestly, for me, is the first step. And then, as you gain more people in your corner, that's how you change the school climate. That's how you get more comfortable with being who you are and representing yourself to the staff. You got to find your people. They're going to give you your confidence.
I agree. And I think that, honestly, that advice could go to anybody, whether you are talking about being your authentic self in the classroom or just going into a classroom for the first year. That first year can be real lonely. And so make sure that you find your people, because I think that is incredibly important. And it's one of the things that got me to continue. Was once I finally found my people, I was like, oh, I enjoy my job.
Yes.
Like, I'm not just a slave to work or I'm just not just a glutton for punishment, I guess, constantly working.
Make
but
it fun.
I had interactions, I had other adults that I can talk with and bounce ideas off of, but also just like sometimes you need someone to vent to who understands.
Absolutely. Yes.
And then for my final question, as LGBTQ plus adults or even our allies, how can we help move the needle in public education towards inclusivity? There are a lot of laws being thrown around over several states in the U.S. right now. So what are some things that you can think of based off of your experience in Missouri?
Honestly, the first one is get out and vote, get educated. Know what's happening in your local elections, vote in your local elections, look who's in your school board. School boards have so much say in how we run our lives in education, how we represent ourselves in education. Know your board members, who is going to support you, who's a butthead. Get involved in your union because they're also going to support you. When I look at more building level, for me, just being myself. Being my authentic self, if you're able to safely in your building, just being visible is going to give kids more confidence. Once kids have a positive association with the queer community, they're going to grow up to be more open-minded adults who aren't going to pass harmful legislation, who aren't going to say harmful things, who aren't going to be toxic. So being a role model for kids who are questioning themselves or maybe figuring some things out and just giving those kids just so much care and love and support so they can be themselves. Honestly, that's how you change everything. Kids got to have that positive role model. They have to see themselves reflected in adults, see themselves as successful adults that are queer. We need more queer educators that are out, who are proud. Post up signs in your classroom. I've got pride flag bunting in my office. I have a rainbow lanyard. I have a Black Lives Matter sign in my office because I want my kids to feel supported. I want my kids who maybe don't have a queer adult in their life to see queer representation, knowing that we're here for you if you do question yourself.
I agree with that 100%. I think that it would have been game-changing for us as people in the 90s growing up to have just a knowledge that queer people existed beyond some stereotypes. I think for you and I'm guessing because of the timeline, we're about the same age. And so my only references were Jack and Will from Will and Grace. And then yours were probably,
Ellen
DeGeneres and Rosie O'Donnell. That was it. That was our available representation. And so I think that representation is so important, and I encourage all who are out there who are considering being an educator but maybe worried about being a queer educator, do it because we need you. The kids need you. And I'm not going to say that it's going to be easy. Every location is going to be different, but find your space and find your people, as you just mentioned.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I've really really enjoyed getting to know you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Bryan. It's been so much fun. Thanks for having me on.
It's my pleasure, indeed. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Teaching While Queer. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Teaching While Queer. If you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing on your favorite RSS feed and sharing the podcast with your friends and family. New episodes will come out every other week during the school year. If you're interested in joining us on the Teaching While Queer podcast, please email us at teachingwhilequeerpodcast@gmail.com. Have a great day.